Bienvenidos a este nuevo episodio de nuestra miniserie Compliance en pocas palabras. Hoy estamos con Christian Hunt, el fundador de Human Risk, y vamos a hablar de Behavioral Compliance. Hi Christian, welcome and thanks for being with us today. And let's start with the first question. Everybody talks about behavioral compliance, but what is it really? How would you define it?
So when I think about behavioral compliance, what I'm thinking about is recognizing the dynamics of what compliance actually is. And that is the business of influencing human decision-making. Now that sounds very strange. People tend to think of compliance as being about rules and regulations. But actually, when we think about how we get an organization to be compliant, we do that by getting all the people within it to do the things that we want them to do and to not do the things that we don't. And you can't just say to an organization, be compliant. It's the people within it that will determine whether or not that happens. And so a behavioral approach to compliance is all about recognizing that fact and saying, if I want to get the organization to be compliant, what I need to do is to influence the people within it in the right way, to be effective at influencing them. That will make sure they do the things I want them to do, they don't do the things I don't, and then de facto, the organization becomes compliant.
Okay, understood. Even I understood it. But do companies really use behavioral compliance tools, or is it all talking?
So on the face of it, when you ask people, are you using behavioral science? Are you doing behavioral compliance? Most companies will say no. But in actual fact, they are doing it. They just may not realize it. And if we think about a typical compliance program, all of the components of that program, so the training, the communications, the controls, all of that revolves around human beings. We write policies for human beings to read. So most companies are using behavioral techniques in their programs. They just may not realize it, and they may not be doing a very good job of it, because if you happen to be successful, that may be more through luck than judgment. And so what I try to shift people away from is this notion that behavioral science is something you suddenly switch on. You're doing it already, you might not realize it, and you might not understand the underlying dynamics. And so what we're doing here when we talk about behavioral compliance is to say, let's be more intelligent about this. Let's recognize what we're trying to do, which is influence individuals. And let's look at the tools and the techniques that we're using and say to ourselves, what do we know from other contexts, from academic research about what drives human decision-making? And then we can pick the ideal tools for the job. So if we happen to have a program that's working well, that might be more through luck than judgment. And so what I propose doing is to use behavioral science intelligently, switch on our understanding of what drives human decision-making, and then you can design something that is much more likely to get the outcomes you're looking for.
Okay, could compliance officer do that alone, or would it be advisable for them to consult their marketing department, where they probably use behavioral insights for many, many decades already?
I think that's such a great question, because if you asked people and said, well, what does compliance have to do with marketing? The average person would say not very much at all. And of course, they are looking at different things. Marketing is an external, generally, and there's a little bit of internal marketing, but generally it's externally facing. You're talking to customers and the wider world. And compliance, you're talking to an internal audience. But you make a really good point, Matthias, is that both of these things are the same thing. We are marketing to people, we're trying to get people to do something. And one of the things I think is fascinating is when you look at marketing and how they are assessed, they are required to justify what they're doing. You wouldn't be allowed, if you were running a marketing function, to say, well, I'm going to run an advertising campaign and we'll just see what happens. I've no idea whether this will work or not, we'll just try it. Or it's what we've always done. You would be fired if you worked on that basis. And yet within compliance, that's exactly what we do. We launch attempts to influence people's human decision-making, and we sort of see what happens without really thinking it through. And you're absolutely correct. If we took some of the skill sets that are deployed in marketing for that external audience, and we thought about the slightly different internal audience and the slightly different objective, but nonetheless it's an objective of influencing people, then we could absolutely learn a lot. And I see a lot of crossover between the requirements of both of those functions and what we can learn from it. So I would love to see much more cross-pollination of skill sets. If you could bring some marketing people into compliance, I think there's a much greater likelihood of getting better outcomes. So I love this idea of seeing these two functions that people generally think of as being very, very different. But actually, if you start to think about what they're doing exactly the same thing. So a lot agree, compliance can learn from marketing.
Could you suggest 2 or 3 behavioral tools for compliance which could prove to have really profound impact, not only to scratching the surface?
So there are lots and lots of behavioral science frameworks that we can pick that are out there and available for people to consult. But I'll start with a much broader, simpler principle. And that is the idea that if we want to be successful in compliance, what we need to do is start thinking about things from the perspective of the target audience. So in other words, not sitting there and saying, these are forced takers of my compliance program. We employ people, we can just tell them what to do. But actually you say, what does this feel like for the employee as they are being required to do the things I want them to do? And that is often something that's missed because we just assume that we can just tell people what to do. And legally we can. But from a practical perspective, if you want people to be engaged, understanding what is it like for them to go through this experience. You want them to attend a training course. Is it genuinely interesting or is it something that's going to bore them? Is this policy easy to navigate and read, or is it full of legalese and compliance language that no one is going to want to understand? And just starting with that basic principle means that you can really start to identify things that probably understandably won't work. And we often think about compliance in terms of inputs. So we measure success by dint of how many people we've put through a training program. But that's an input, that's not an output. We often don't look at what knowledge did they glean from this. And if there is knowledge that people glean from compliance training, it's often things like, how many years will I go to jail for failing to comply with this particular regulation? Now that's an easy thing to test, but it's an absolutely irrelevant thing for the average employee. We don't want people thinking this rule is 5 years in jail, this one is 10, I'll break the one with 5 years. We want people to understand what it is we want them to do, and yet we often transmit information that's useless. So this idea of looking at it and saying, what's it like from the employee's perspective? In the same way that we would look at things from the customer perspective. We wouldn't put customers through an awful experience and still expect them to buy our product. We shouldn't expect our employees to go through an awful experience and still be compliant. And that matters hugely because there are lots of things in the compliance sphere where there's a qualitative element, where you don't just need people to do something, you need people to be engaged, to do it for the right reasons, under the right circumstances. And if you need that, then you need to work with them. So the big message I have for people is, yes, there are lots of frameworks that can allow you to do this, lots of techniques that you can deploy. But the big thing is just start by thinking about your employee, not as a forced taker of your program, but actually as someone who you need to engage. And then you can start to recognize whether the tools that you're using are appropriate and whether they work or not. And you can do that in a very sophisticated way, or you can do it in a very, very simple way, which is, what does this genuinely feel like for the average person on the ground? And let's not assume that they are passionate about compliance, because if they were passionate about compliance, they would be working in compliance. Let's assume that they are trying to do other things. And so we say, how does this fit into their day-to-day existence? And just that very, very simple approach can lead you to make simple changes to the program that will deliver better outcomes.
Thank you very much, Christian. I think it's very valuable because what you are saying is behavioral is not only a tool, it's much more profound. It's shifting the focus from rules to decision-making. And that's what it's all about. And then you have a much broader toolkit of tools to influence people to make good decisions. Thank you so much.